while we're fixing some of the technical problems, let me just go ahead and welcome you to this session. I'm really delighted to be moderating it and to have with me such lucid, elegant thinkers and writers. And so I want to start by giving you a sense of their work. So trained as a physicist, Stefan Klein became a science writer and editor in the 1990s. His book, The Science of Happiness, which was published in German in 2002 and in English 4 years later, was an international influential bestseller. And another 4 of his books have been translated into English, as well as many other languages. Leonardo's Legacy, The Secret Pulse of Time, Survival of the Nicest, which is about altruism, a subject we'll talk about as well, and All by Chance, about coincidence and unpredictability. Sudhir Kakar is a psychoanalyst who is also a novelist and a scholar, and like Stefan, an author who has published widely, 21 books, and I should probably say 20 plus, because I feel that you're maybe adding to that number even as we speak, and translations in as many languages. He's explored a number of subjects, preeminent among them cultural psychology, so the influence of culture and psyche, what effect culture has on psyche, and the psychology of religion. Among his many works of nonfiction are Intimate Relations, The Analyst and the Mystic, and The Indian Psyche, as well as a new translation of the Kama Sutra, which he published with Wendy Doniger. His new novel is The Devil Take Love, published last year, and his most recent nonfiction study is The Young Tagore, The Makings of a Genius, which is the first psychobiography of Tagore. So, happiness, the question of East and West, brain science, sex, the transformations that people can affect in themselves. We've got a lot to talk about in the next 45 minutes, after which we'll take questions from the audience for the last 15 or 20 minutes. So, Can Everyone Be Happy is the title of our panel. So, since you've both thought a great deal about concepts that do and don't span national boundaries and cultural boundaries, I think the first question I wanted to start with was, is there a kind of universal concept of happiness? Would you agree that people across cultures actually experience happiness in the same ways? And I should say, I suspect you disagree about this, which is the reason I'm starting here.
Yeah. Well, I think, and there is there is actually very good evidence that happiness is a human universal. Every human being feels happiness in the same way. And we have been known this for quite a while. We have been known this since the late 60s, when a then young American psychologist called Paul Ekman traveled to Papua New Guinea to visit a tribe who was without any contact to the outside world, and he would explore how those people would convey and how they would experience feelings. And he found that there is no difference as to what Americans or Indians or Eskimos or whoever think. So the feeling is a human universal. What is different is in some ways, is what triggers those feelings. So, for example, you see, I come from the mountains. I was brought up in Austria, in the Alps. And for me, one of the most beautiful experiences at all is to stand on the top of the mountain and just see the world under me. And I know that there are people who are afraid of the mountains, but they will have the very same feeling when standing, for example, at the shore of an ocean, if you were brought up by the seaside. So you really have to distinguish, and I think this is very important, between the feeling itself and what triggers the feeling.
Okay, you asked me about the culture part, but I think you're quite right to say a universal kind of happiness. There is a universal feeling or a need towards that. I would even doubt where one should one can be happy or whether one should be happy at all. But we'll talk about it later, whether being happy goes against something very important otherwise too. But coming to that question, we know that a child is happy in a different way, a young adult and a middle age. So there's a very different kinds of definitions of happiness. Actually, as an older man, the best definition I like is by the actress Ingrid Bergman, that happiness is a good digestion and a bad memory. Because as long as your body is okay and anyone hurts you, you forget immediately. So that is happiness. But the culture part, I think, is very important because a lot of our psychological knowledge comes from a small class, subset of the human population, which the psychologists Lickerman and all have called weird, W-E-I-R-D. W for Western, E for educated, I for industrialized, R for rich, and D for democratic. So most of our psychological knowledge comes from this small set. And to give an example of how that is, there was a study on morality, and there were about 12 populations, Brazilian slum, something in Indonesia, but one was University of Pennsylvania students. So 12, and they were given stories and asked, is it wrong, and if so, why? And one of the stories which I remember is that a man goes to the supermarket, buys a chicken, comes, cooks it, has intercourse with the chicken, and eats it. Is there something wrong with it? All the other 11 were a bit, there's something wrong, they couldn't say why. Only the University of Pennsylvania students, which are very much weird, says, no, there's nothing wrong with it. It is his property, it is done in private, and it is not hurting anyone. So these are very nice liberal values. Now, the thing is that so much of our psychological knowledge, as I said, comes from this very weird population. There are a lot of psychological books where experiments done on 20 or 200 American college students, and then they are kind of generalized that this is what human beings are like. So I think we should be always very doubtful, or not doubtful, but at least skeptical. Take any psychological things which you read in newspapers, etc., to question it and take it to the prism of culture. Is it so?
So can you give us a specific example of what can you give us a specific example of what you think these differences might be and how they might show up? For example, I mean, this goes really to the heart of the culture and psyche work.
In the happiness part of it? Yeah, well, a very simple example would be, let's take the Buddhist view, which I think has been also the Indic one we have shared, which will be probably defined as happiness is absence of suffering. So it is not something positive, which would be very American, that we should be going towards it, but absence of suffering is the minimalist view. So that would be one cultural part of it. For instance, that would mean that when Buddha says sarvam dukkham, everything is suffering. So he's not looking at the world as full of all kind of opportunities, everything is wonderful around the corner, and if you could work hard enough, and if your parents were good enough, you would have great happiness, etc. He is of the view, no, I mean that everything is. So one cultural part would be, which of course I think the founder of my discipline, Freud, also shared. I mean, he is also a minimalist about happiness, because when he's asked what is the aim of psychoanalysis, he says, to transform human misery into common human unhappiness. So get rid of only misery, not the great happiness. So that is very much a cultural view shared. And I would say, actually, both a slightly depressive attitude towards the world is the most reality. Both are very realist. Look at what is happening into the world around you, and if you are still completely singing in the rain, etc., all the time. I mean, you should be able to sing in the rain and have ecstasy, but if you are looking at the world around you, then to be happy all the time is not very in touch with reality. And one knows that grave mental illnesses is loss of touch with reality. So to be happy is to lose touch with reality.
Well, I think it's important to make 2 points there. I fully concur to this skepticism of certain psychological experiments, and you see a major problem is with them is that often people are just asked. You just ask them, and you do not ask, well, do you feel happy? And you have to ask them another question before. You have to ask them, and what is happiness for you? If you don't ask that question, you got into a horrible cultural confusion. Now, I would not have dared to write a book on the science of happiness on such experiments alone, for that very reason. I think we have gone beyond mere psychology, beyond mere questioning people, in the sense that through neurobiology we have certainly not a complete, but a quite wide-ranging understanding of what goes on inside ourselves when we have certain feelings, what goes on inside our brains, what goes on in our bodies. And it turns out that those processes are, of course, not dependent on culture and not dependent on people's conceptions of happiness, but are really the same for an Indian as for somebody from Pennsylvania. And I think this is really the added value that research has brought in the last 20 years or so. And then I think it is also important to make clear what one understands of happiness. And in the understanding of modern neuropsychology, it is an emotion. Happiness is an emotion, and that is something very simple. That is an automatic reaction of your bodies and of your brains towards some external stimulus or towards something you just imagine, and you can measure it. And frequently it's being mixed up with more complicated concepts like contentness with life or a larger well-being, and that is one thing. That is something different, and I think it's very important to make clear what one is talking about.
So I don't want us to go down the complete rabbit hole of neuropsychology versus cultural relativism, but I think this point I do want us to actually dilate on a little bit, which is to ask, first of all, do you agree with the sort of brain sciences approach that Stefan has laid out? And secondly, and this may be a way of focusing the question, is there something that happy people share in your practice, for instance?
Okay, two things. First, the brain research. I think sometimes we underestimate that the brain is as much a cultural and social organ as a biological one. As you know, in Germany, Gerhard Roth and all, that you pass.
Sorry, I'm really having a problem to understand it because the echo is very strong. So either can please the sound engineers do something about it, or we changed our seatings, and is it easier for you? Okay.
It doesn't matter for me whatsoever, but let's.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, no. I was saying is that that the whole neurosciences, etc., is a very, very interesting pointing thing. But I think one but underestimates that the brain is as much a cultural and social organ as a biological one. So yes, you're right. The hardware of the brain is universal, but what the software is, there you have a kind of problems. Now, just to give one example, which there is supposed to be something called the Müller-Lyle illusion. These are those two lines which are of equal length, but which have arrows, one arrow on two sides, one going this way and one going that way. And anyone who looks at it sees not them equal length, but the one which goes outside is bigger, although they are two, so longer. Now, this is supposed to be a universal one, but It is not true of places of where people grow up in round huts, because the explanation is that we grow up with buildings with corners, street lines, etc. But anyone who grows up in round huts does not have the same illusion. So even your visual perception, which you would think is not cultural, is formed by the cultural part. Now, sorry.
Go ahead. I was going to say, let's have one more exchange along these grounds, and then we'll come to something I think you were both going to agree on. But Sudhir, do you want to finish?
The second part.
Yeah.
The second. So what would be my discipline? Well, it would say that happiness is a gift. You should be prepared for it. It is transitory, and when it comes, you should be able to recognize it. And what is the preparation? Well, preparation is not easy, but there are three things. Actually, from Freud, it is only love and work. If you can do those two well, you are prepared to be happy. That is the mental health. I would add the Chinese one. The Chinese say love, work, and hope. So if someone to love, something to work at, and something to hope for, that is the baseline of happiness. That would be mine.
Well, I'd like to comment about two things. First, yes, the Ash experiment is a very interesting illusion, but it is not something what happiness is about. This is such a judgment, a perceptual judgment, is something way more complicated than happiness. Happiness, as it turns out, is actually something very simple. You see, after that book on happiness, I did a book on time, and people were asking me, well, now it must be much easier to write on time than on happiness. No, this is not true. Perception of time is far more complicated than perception of happiness, for example. So I think the analogy just doesn't apply. And you would find many of the very same mechanisms that generate that feeling of happiness, not only in humans of all cultures, but even in other creatures, like in animals. And it has been shown over and over again that even certain and the most important triggers for what makes us happy are cultural universals. So one of them, for example, is, well, you know, money. So people tend to think that money would make you happy. Well, indeed it does. A salary rise does make you happy, but guess for how long? For only so long as you got accustomed that you are going to earn more. And you find this all over the place, all over the world. I should say at the moment where you are above an existential minimum. This is important. This is important to state. Friendship, fairness. Those are things that make people happy all over the world. So I would be, well, in brief, I would say the hardware is very important, and understanding that hardware is what really gets us on to understanding this phenomenon. Understanding the hardware also of how we interact with other people.
So I think one of the things that's interesting that comes out of even that exchange is the fact that love, work, hope, those are things that appear basically that Sudhir has said that also are really crucial in your book in terms of the ingredients. And so while the diagnosis may be different, some of the practical steps that people can take in order to make themselves happier or to produce happiness actually possibly you share. But here's a broader question, which is, it goes to our panel title, should we try to be happy? Should we all try to be happy? And what is the virtue of unhappiness?
Yeah. Not the alternative. I mean, I agree with all of that, because when we said love, work needs others, work needs others, so that we will come to. Okay, sorry. not the alternative, but another way of being is, okay, not only my discipline, again I come to Buddhism, it is of being as aware, to live as aware as you can. So self-understanding, and then which increases the understanding of others. So to live a very, very aware life. Every moment, everything, every object should be almost new. Now so which means theoretically you can undergo a course of psychoanalysis, years, and end up sadder than when you started, but much more aware. Because understanding is the most important part, and which understanding means also not going away from suffering, not going away from pain. To contemplate your pain is a very, very important part of it. And it is not only psychoanalysis, you see it everywhere. I think the poet Emily Dickinson has it, that the heart cannot forget unless it contemplates what it rejects. The poet Rumi, Mr. Sufi, has the same thing. Don't avert your gaze, keep on looking at the bandaged place, because that is where the light comes from. So it is not only psychoanalysis, that this is the other way of being, is to be as aware, live as aware as you can. One of my favorite analysts, Bjorn, expresses it very nicely, that I would not like only to dig, cook, and eat potatoes, I would like to sing potatoes. So that is the kind of what is being offered the other way.
Yeah. I think, while methods like psychoanalysis are to be praised as a way to gain insight, there are other ways, like meditation, for example. I'm not sure if psychoanalysis is a best strategy for everyone, but it definitely is one strategy. But I do not agree with the statement that happiness is a gift, I agree that it is a gift, but the sad truth is that in many cases when we in fact receive that gift, we are not aware that we have received the gift. And what neuropsychology has shown us in the last 20 years or so, and I think this is really new in a sense, that you can train how to become more aware of having received a gift. And this training of awareness will reinforce you to make it in the future even easier for you to become aware of your good moments, of your good emotions. It will enhance your resilience towards stressful situations. And I think that psychology and psychotherapy in the last years has very late, but come to realize how important it is to focus on positive emotions in order to alleviate suffering. And I think that traditional methods of psychotherapy, like psychoanalysis, for a way too long time have had a blind spot on that.
Would you like to respond very briefly? Because I have another place I want us to go, which is, I'll just follow up and to say, but the question is this understanding of happiness
individual?
Is there some virtue in unhappiness? And I say this because Stefan's new edition of the Science of Happiness in German has a chapter on sort of society. And so will you follow up on that and talk to us? I, for instance, happy though I may be, have entered into a deep depression about the future of American politics and actually the global stability. And that seems entirely rational, and frankly, I can't even imagine how anyone can be happy with the state of things. So can we move? I think one of the problems with this sort of happiness industry, at least as it's existed in the United States, is that it has been so individualistic. It's been about things like singing in the shower, Gretchen Rubin's Happiness Project, which basically occupied the #1 spot on the Times bestseller list. So how do we, Stefan has worked on altruism as well, how do we create happier societies?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if one really can create them, but I think that, well, at least we can take more or less sensible steps, and we have really learned in the last years that happiness is not a petty, individualistic concept, but it is really something that applies to the whole of society. We know now that happiness and well-being is contagious. So, for example, when you are together, and you have to be physically together, so Facebook won't work. When you are physically together with people who are, well, at least reasonably happy, this will rise your own well-being. This is one very interesting finding of the last years. Other findings have been that the systems that generate that feeling of happiness within us are modulated by a social setting. So, for example, in situations that people perceive as being fair, they feel happier, and you can even measure it. In situations where people cooperate, as compared to situations where people are working on their own side or are in competition towards to each other, humans are happier, and well, there are first, even in the corporate sector, this is slowly being understood, and there are first companies who've stopped, for example, to pay individual bonuses because they have come to realize through such findings that it is not a smart idea, that it is not a good way to keep the corporation running in the long run and to alleviate the well-being of their workers. So this is one of many examples.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I think there was some misunderstanding. I'm not against happiness at all. What I am for is that there's a higher than happiness. To me, happiness is secondary. The higher one is self-awareness, living awareness. So that was. And then how to be happy, you're quite right that there are three things: fairness, status, and relatedness. So there is as you said, if there's an unfair thing, you really feel it as like a slap in the face. If there's a status difference, if somebody makes you aware of a status difference, you feel very, very bad. So in fact, in the corporations, even to say, let me give you some advice, you feel it as a status difference, the brain acts. Then there's a relatedness, that anyone who comes in who is not seen to be your group is going to create unhappiness. So that's why you say diverse teams, but unless you train those teams much, much more beforehand, those teams are not going to work because your brain is going to react to the stranger. So you are quite right about the thing. To me, actually, happiness, there are two. One is a short one, individual one, which is to have modest expectations. So we react to pain of losing something much, much more than to the pleasure of gaining something. So that is one thing to do, have modest expectations, so one. And the second, of course, is, I think, very, very important, which the Buddhists say and which now the modern psychology will say. Dalai Lama, as you say, says, to concentrate on oneself is a producer of suffering. To concentrate on others is a bringer of happiness. So that one. Yeah. And that now you see in all kind of not only situations but also psychological tests. Not the happiness, but there's one very interesting study about aspirin. Which is prescribed for heart attacks and all, that to give help to someone is 5 times as better for your longevity than taking aspirin every day. Just to listen to someone is twice as effective as taking aspirin. And there's the most wonderful study, a very moving study is by a social psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, where he brought nursing mothers into one room and divided them into two. One watched videos of helping behavior, people helping others, and the other watched videos of comedians. The group of nursing mothers which watched helping behavior had more milk. They were touching their babies much, much more than the other group which watched comedians. So that is really, I think, inbuilt in us, which we do not, under this guise or ideology of I, that this is also built into us, the altruism. Chimpanzees help an adult they see in difficulty. Even a 2, 3-year-old, when they sees an adult in difficulty, helps. So that is one, as I said, very much old one, Buddhist, compassion against suffering. That is
right. I'm just going to jump in and say, so one of the things that's happened historically, right, is that happiness has gone from being defined as a product of being a good and virtuous person. So Cicero says famously, if you're a virtuous person, you'll be happy even on the rack. I don't know if the rest of us would go that far, but that's certainly a historical understanding. From being good to actually having and being able to find pleasure, which is a much more from the Enlightenment forward. At least that's the way that the historian Darren McMahon has told the story of happiness. And so I guess what I'm pushing still further on is the sort of social, so you're each talking in a sense about direct personal experiences, right? Almost face-to-face experiences. But what about living in a fairer society? Because we've talked about fairness, but not just fairness to your co-workers or to your family members, but what about living in a fairer society? Is that crucial, do you think?
Well, yes, absolutely. I concur fully to what Sudhir has said, and to put it bluntly, and it's no overstatement to say happiness is much more about what you can give than about what you can get. And I think this holds both in personal face-to-face relationships, but it also holds in society as a whole. And it has been shown very convincingly and very repeatedly that what is important about well-being in society is the amount in which humans have or feel that they have control about what is happening to them. What is important is the degree of participation. And a beautiful study on that has been done in Switzerland. Now, many of you may or may not know that Switzerland is a very federalistic country, and it has in its states very different constitutions, and they differ precisely in how much citizens can contribute to decisions and how much they can influence decisions. What you see is the subjective well-being is the higher, not the richer they are, but it is the higher, the more every individual is given the possibility to influence what is going on in society. And I found this a very impressive finding, and I think, yes, the science of happiness has a lot to tell us on what steps to take for better societies, for better organizations, for better schools even.
Yeah. It just struck me as you were talking, that we were talking about fairness, status, and relatedness in psychological experiments, etc. But actually, on societal level, it just struck me, they are the same as the French Revolution. So fairness is justice, status is democracy, so fraternity, égalité, and relatedness is fraternity, brotherhood. Now, I think what's happening in lots of societies, and especially in ours, that one or the other has become too strong. So everything is justice now. Even France, they seem to have forgotten brotherhood. Where is the fraternity gone? But brotherhood or compassion is as important, and in our own society, there have been actually the icons of our society, both Gandhi and Tagore, I mean, who held that compassion is the most important. It may not be, but it is as important as justice and fairness, democracy. And I think we forget that without all three, happiness, whether society or the individual, is not going to be there.
So we've thus far had a conversation that's actually been, in a way, quite rational, right? About rational, set of rational self-maximizing or society-maximizing processes. And I'm wondering if we can bring in the darker elements. This is, I look to the psychoanalyst, of course, for this, to say, but what about the fact that there are these kind of, the pull of negative emotion, the fact that people oftentimes are seduced by the sort of extremely negative emotion. So I'm thinking about actually a figure, the Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Stekel, who says people want dictatorship in the 30s because they like to feel fear. They like to feel fear. And so are we overestimating either sort of the rationality of the ways in which brain science has been construed, or you know, just a kind of logical, reasonable discussion?
Yes, I mean, as a psychoanalyst, it will not become me to say that there are no darker emotions at all. I mean, that is what one deals with, that they are part of human beings as much as the altruistic emotions. What do you do with them? And the thing is that rationality does not help there too much. That is what our problems all comes from, that we think rationality is going to solve those or tame those darker emotions. All one can do is try to bring them up, look at where they come from in oneself, what do they do to me, and whether I can keep on repeating that to tame them, that they do not become or overpower me. One can only say that, I mean, most of our mental life, 95% or more, is unconscious. We know that. Our consciousness, rationality is only the tip of the iceberg. The rest of it takes place down there. But the voice of rationality is low, it is small, but if it keeps on being repeated, one hopes, and not only hopes, but over a time, it does command a hearing. It does change, but it's not easy. So any easy solutions to how to get that out, I mean, they may be right. I personally have doubts about that.
Well, I think the question is what type of rationality. I think it is indeed rational to acknowledge the very strong impacts emotions have upon us, and negative emotions. And I think in world politics, we are going through phases where this is demonstrated in an extent that is just shocking. So currently, elections in democracies all over the place are being won purely on triggering negative emotions, on triggering storms of negative emotions. So one needs to be really blind not to see this. The question then is, what is a rational strategy to deal with negative emotions? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that there is a cathartic effect of really going into negative emotions and of analyzing their origin as psychoanalysis has it. To my impressions, the findings are much more convincing, which point to strategies that have been told in, well, especially in Eastern traditions, not only in Eastern traditions, but mostly for 2,500 years, that is become aware of those emotions, accept them, as being there, but don't go into them. Emotions are signals. See them as being there, and then, as any meditation guru would have it, come back to reality, come back to the presence. And this is what has been shown as a very good strategy, for example, when dealing with depressions or when dealing with chronic anger.
Excellent. Let's take some questions from the audience. So I see a lot of hands up, and I know I'm putting up my hand only because it's quite blinding, the light here. And so if the colleagues who are bringing around mics, if you all will just randomly assign people mics, that would be great. We have way more questions than we have time for. And please keep your questions short as possible.
The mic is not working.
Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Humayun Jamil. Well, what I could understand from your discussions, and especially Mr. Stefan, that you are talking about happiness as something, which is dependent on a lot of things like brotherhood, altruism, and status, and so many other physical or, social entities. What my question is, especially to Mr. Stefan, is that how do you relate happiness with individualism or individuals? Like, we know that some people, we say they are very happy-go-lucky people. Some people are intrinsically happy, and some people are not, whatever may be the circumstances. Some people in very adverse situations are more happy than the others, who are, in very well-placed situations, or should be very happy if we see it that way.
Thank you,
sir.
So
my question would be,
we got it.
How much of that is inherited, or how much are you wired genetically to be happy? So that is my question.
Fantastic, thanks.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Thank you very much. Well, as we have learned, 20 years ago, it thought it was inherited, that there was a happiness set point and you can do nothing about this. We have learned a lot in the last years that you really can shift that set point, and that is by training. You really can tune yourself, not fully, but you can train yourself to be happier because the brain is a plastic system, and this takes discipline, this takes time, and this also explained why people in situations where you think they should be happy are not. Because, put it thus, they have bad habitudes. They have bad mental habitudes.
But
I'm sorry, given the number of people we've got asking questions, I'm just going to...
One point. See, my question was, how much of that is genetic? Like you say that something can be done about it. But is it that some people are wired more to be happy and others are not? You can't do anything about that.
Before you
the answer is no, it's not hardwired.
Will you,
my name is Professor Sitesh Dutt. I am a management professor and I've worked in industry also. My question is, there was a nation called Bhutan, which says that instead of doing gross domestic product, which normally everybody does and we get worried. For instance, in India, we are worried GDP is going to come down for 2%. What is more important for us is a concept called gross domestic happiness. In fact, replace GDP with GDH, which is the subject which you are talking about. Because happiness is a very nebulous concept. What is happiness? And can you have a concept like gross domestic happiness? That means it is the sum of happiness in the country.
Thank you.
Goes to you, huh?
Yeah. I think it was late 90s, 97, 98. I was invited to Bhutan. They asked the UNDP that they want this gross national happiness. What are the concrete things to be done to measure the gross national happiness. So it was a very interesting trip for me for a small seminar of their officials and ministers, etc. And you can develop also, if you look at, say, that one of the most important things for adult human beings is, okay, 2-3 things, but also caring for the next generation, caring for children. Now, can you look at indexes for caring in that society? I think you can. How divorces, when do they happen? How do they happen? There are indexes you can make out of that. So, but that is not the. But you are quite right. I mean, I would be all for it. But it is the difficulties of the gross national happiness indexing is much more than just getting the economic figures out of it. That you are quite right about.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Imran Merchant. I'm here in the front seat, Dr. Kakar. So far in the discussion, I'm a bit surprised that one of the major factors that is quite often contributing to the concepts of human unhappiness is the notion of the certainty of death, the notion of the intimations of our mortality. So I frame my question from that context. Because most of us understand that happiness is going to be a transitory thing. Now we are weighed down by the idea that we know that life on earth is for a specific period which has got to sell by date. In the end is going to come. So how do you react, either of you, to this particular idea that you cannot have a discussion on the possibilities of happiness unless you bring on board this idea of the intimations of our mortality?
Look, there I have been taught a lot by patients who thought they had terminal cancer but survived it. And they would consistently tell me that in retrospect, they were in a way glad that they had this horrible suffering because it taught them something. It taught them what an incredibly valuable gift life is. And and it made them more aware of the gift that every moment is. And that would be my answer to that.
I think all the religions do deal with that. I mean, that's why when Buddha says sarvam dukkham and knows the deaths, so what to do about it? So, and that's where we underestimate the religions, that they go to the core of what you would call the unhappiness part, that we are all going to die. But secular people also deal with it, immortality. So what is a secular immortality? One is, of course, my genes would, now in the scientific term, my genes would survive. So I'm not completely dead because my genes are going into children. So that is one immortality. The other is what I have built up. So every smallest shop you go to, there is the photograph of I founded this. Or a clinic, the doctor, my name. So there would be some writing books is also of, okay, I might die, but something of me would survive. So there are, all the time we are trying for that immortality. We do not want to, of course, be aware of it. That is a very, very big unconscious part which goes on in it. And that is one of the big emotional part, and which I wanted to say first to accept is that the emotional tail wags the rational dog. Once you accept that, then you start doing with other things.
Thank you. I see a lady in the back who's her hand up for a while. Yes. Thank you.
Mr. Sudhir Kakar has spoken about awareness, being aware of life. Even the other gentleman spoke about cancer patient. Now, my question is to both of you all, to be happy, that's a topic, can we be happy always? Can we create a habit to be happy? Is it possible to create a good habit to be happy always?
Well, it is not possible to be happy all the time because happiness is a signal. And a signal would not work if it would be there all the time. But what is possible is to create habits and to create or to raise an awareness for the good moments. become more aware when you are happy. What does it feel like? And this can change your life. Even if it doesn't make you happy all the time, this is not the point, but it does change your life.
I see another lady in the back who's had her hand up in the middle there for quite some time.
I had a question for you. You mentioned about, the American politics, and there is a general, sense of gloom and depression around, both the, candidatures. I wanted to ask you that is there a new trend towards being more cynical and, accepting things, accepting people who sometimes talk things negatively, and people end up believing them more than people who are painting a happy picture. So just wanted to know your views on that.
Sorry,
So
I couldn't understand
I think
that.
the question
Neither
is,
could I.
yeah, I think the question is whether being more cynical might actually, so let me just repeat it for the audience and I'll repeat it for my fellow panelists, whether being more cynical might actually conduce to more happiness.
Yeah, yeah. Being more cynical. Yeah,
Cynical.
I think, one of the psychotherapy schools is about that what is your vision of reality? So the tragic vision is common to all. We are all afflicted by fate, blows of fate, children die, spouses die, parents die, other bad things happen to us. Now what do we do about them? So one is the romantic vision, which is, it is so, but if you struggle, if you do some things good, etc., you are going to get to a higher reality where that becomes unimportant. So that is the spiritual part of it, that you will be not that reality, higher one. And the other one is the cynical, or let's say the ironical. And that is, yes, it is so, it is always going to be so, all gods have clay feet, don't believe, etc. And so you take pride in your cynicism of, in which you have examples of many French writers of that. You don't call it cynicism, I would call it the ironical view of how to deal with the tragedy of life.
Okay, folks, we've got one more question.
Hi. Right. I just want to say that there was a book written by a famous philosopher called Bertrand Russell. Obviously, everybody knows of him. And I read his book called The Conquest of Happiness. There is one problem with that book, that I only read half of it. And the other half I don't recall very well. But I was very interested to know what he meant. Now, it went over my head. So very briefly, I'd like to speak to Mr. Kakar, ask him actually, if he got what Mr. Bertrand Russell was saying, and he agreed with him, and there was some kind of an understanding that he was able to create for us guys to understand about being able to conquer happiness. Thank you.
Shall I? Okay. Russell, now, well, I would like to talk to Russell, but not on happiness. Russell was an eminent philosopher, and he suffered from cyclothymia, that is from a manic depressive illness. And that book, The Conquest on Happiness, was one way he invented to cope with his own situations, and he did not manage very well. And I think this has also to do with the fact that at that time there were not really empirical findings about happiness. There was what he could think of it. Now we are in a different situation. We have now, through empirics, through science, we have a way of telling the better ideas apart from the not so good ideas. And I think that is what progress is.
No.
Sudhir, will you have the last word then?
No, I'm glad that the romantic vision of reality also continues in the clothes of science.
So thank you all so much for coming. I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions, but thanks so much. And will you please thank these two panelists?